Hey everyone, I'm Mitch. I'm one of the pastors here, and you are watching episode 2 of a series of messages that we are calling Keep the Change. Let's go.
Last weekend, we started this teaching series called Keep the Change. It's a 3-week series. It has to do with our finances, and I'll explain all that again in a minute. But it was so interesting to me, after I taught it last week, I had 2 different conversations with 2 wildly different people in the Commons area after one of our services. But they essentially said to me the exact same thing in the end. And basically, this is what they said. They're talking to me about the message. They're like, Greg, that was so weird. That was so weird. Now, when I'm aiming for what I'm going for in a message, it's usually not for people to say, that was so weird. But follow this with me. So, first person that told me this, background. They moved across the border from Illinois, as did half of you in the room. Welcome to Indiana. We're glad that you're here. They had really taken a little while to find a church home when they first moved over here. It hadn't been the highest priority, but then they walked through our doors, having a good experience here. They truthfully hadn't gone to church that often back over in Illinois, and when they did, it was a church that was so wildly different than Suncrest, and they had a wildly different experience with how that church talked about money than how I talked about money last week. They're like, Greg, I was gearing up for it. I'm like, oh, this is the money series. This is where he tells me how much I have to give. This is where, and I don't know if any of you ever had this experience. They're like, we were at church, and they basically sent us an invoice. This is your part, financially to help us do our thing. And it was heavy-handed, it was whatever. And he's like, and when you talked last week, you didn't really even talk about giving. That was so weird. I'm like, okay, I'll accept that one then. That is so weird. Then, second conversation. Totally different story. There's a couple at our church, they have a couple of young kids, and they've been coming for about a year now. But they really have never been to church before in adult life. This is a brand new experience for them. And they were telling me last week that after they had been here for about 6 or 9 months, about 3 to 6 months ago, they started thinking, well, we should contribute financially. Now, their thought about contributing financially was not centered in their faith. It wasn't about trusting God. It wasn't about giving generously. It was much more functional than that. They're like, well, our kids enjoy the kids program, and somebody has to pay the NIPSCO bill around here, so how do we do our part? We pay for our kids to play travel softball, and we went to Dino Time last week, dropped $100 there. Let's just do our part. And then they're like, but we can't figure out how to give. You don't talk about it very often. Even what Noah just said a few seconds ago, that's a lot more how do we do this? I know you say there's boxes in the backs, but am I just supposed to put cash in there? And then they're like, but then you said you're going to do a message about money. And we thought, you're going to explain to us how to do it. And then you didn't. That was so weird. I'm like, well, all right, let me just bring us all up to speed. I know a lot of you are new around here. This is kind of how it works. This should not be a surprise to anyone. Usually, about once a year, I do a teaching series about money. It usually lasts about 3 weeks. It actually usually is in February. Some of you have been coming to Suncrest for years, and we didn't do it in February this year. And you're like, are we not doing a teaching series about money? But yes, we are. It's just in May this year. But usually, one of the weeks, and next week will be this, I will talk about generosity. I think it's an important part of our life. It's about our faith and trust in God. It is one of the ways that God uses us to make a difference in the world and in our church. So I will talk about that. But it's so important to me that when you associate God and money, you understand that it's much, much bigger, that he wants something for you, not just something from you, and that he has a way, a wisdom, a way that he looks at life that would be helpful to us financially, not just asking for something. And so, for that reason, we're doing Keep the Change. Today is week 2, And this is kind of the vision for the series. Like I said last week, Keep the Change is about freedom and about formation in your finances. Freedom being really a feeling that we feel. You have felt freedom before. Like, it's one of the best feelings that we have. When I run into someone and they've been holding a grudge against someone, and I can lead them to forgive someone else, like, I see it happen in their life, like freedom comes over them. They're no longer carrying the grudge. Or if someone's carrying a habit that's sinful, I told you about a guy who was committing adultery last week, and they can confess it and say it out loud, and sure, there's a freedom. The feeling of freedom comes with that. It doesn't have me anymore. And that's essentially the same idea that I want us to see with our finances, that if your finances to you are a dark cloud hanging over your head, you don't have enough margin, so it creates angst and anger and fear and unsettledness, there's a way out of that. And we started talking about that last week. I'll talk about it again today. Be like, oh, you could experience freedom. Enough freedom in your life so that you have margin in your life, so if you're out and you want to say, keep the change, you can say it without stress at all. But the other part of this is formation. It's about generating long-lasting change in our life. It's about having a vision for maybe I could, should, desire to handle money differently than I have been, and life could be better if I have a new formation. So I do have a question. I genuinely want you to raise your hands on this because I'm genuinely trying to get a sense in the room. Some of you are people who you would say, my parents taught me about money, and it was a great gift. They taught me wisely. They taught me, with great diligence. They really helped me understand. They helped me see, and they walked with me. My parents did that. And others of you are like, my parents didn't do that at all. They either didn't teach me or they taught me the wrong thing, definitely modeled the wrong thing. And my life is trying to do the opposite of what my parents did. So I'm curious in this room, how many of you would say your parents taught you well, and how many of you would say your parents didn't teach you well? And if you happen to be sitting next to your parents, I will let you lie if you would like to. Okay. So how many of you, show of hands, would say, my parents, they taught me really well. Like, I went into adulthood, and thank God for my parents. All right. And how many of you would say, my parents did not teach me well? I was flying blind into adulthood, had some bad habits. And this is what's so interesting to me. The formation process of our lives when it comes to money, it's kind of hit or miss based on whether you had parents who did this well or not. And it's so interesting to me that people who change their orientation around money to healthy orientations and do so early in their life. This is why I actually want just all of our high school students to hear this series. One of our college students. I want everyone who's getting married at 23 and starting a life to hear this series, because if formation can happen then, it sets the course for the long term. The truth is, if we're really talking about theory of change and how most people change and when they change in this world, this is a pretty common and well-established theory. Most people do not change until the pain of not changing is greater than the pain of changing. About anything in your life. Most people do not change until the pain of not changing, until you crash and burn, until you experience something that you just can't handle anymore, and then finally you have to change. But if it was possible to set a new course, a formative formation, like where you'd say, I'm going to do this, and it's going to establish lasting change, and it's going to carry me the rest of my life. I want the wisdom of the scriptures to be a gift to you. So, last week I talked about the process for any change in our life. I'm just going to hit this very briefly this week. For any change, financial or not, this is how change works. First, you have to pay attention to your deeper desires. Every toddler has, just kind of that carnal desire. Whatever's in front of me, I want it, right? But once you get past 5 years old, you have the ability to start conceptualizing things and say, even though I want that thing that's right in front of me, I want something else more. I call this deeper desires, but in some ways, they're actually just loftier desires. I hope that over time, you, in your life, have a desire to be someone who's honorable, to be a person who's noble, to be a difference maker in this world, and let those deeper desires cut off those elementary carnal desires that do exist inside every one of us. The second thing is about embracing reality. Any change is really this simple to think about. Any change in your life. The change is to move from here to there. This is not complicated. You are in a certain place, and you want to be in a different place. That's change in our life. But it's very difficult to go from here to there without being clear about there. Where are you going? Although most of the time we're clear about that. The bigger difficulty is to be honest about here. Where am I today? Years ago, I stopped taking appointments for marriage trouble in our church. And one of the reasons I stopped is because I was helping no one when they would sit in my office and talk about it. I just noticed that. I'm like, not working, right? Somebody else should do this. You know what the only thing I was more useless at than marriage counseling for people is marriage counseling with only one person in the room. The husband or the wife, but not both. And it's so interesting when you talk to people alone about the troubles in their marriage, almost always they talk about how hard it is, mostly because of the other person. But then when you get two people in the room together, it's like truth serum. It's like, oh, I actually have to be honest. I can't tell my version of the story. And this is what I see and change all the time. If you're just telling your version of the story, if you're not really defining where you really are, the here, if you're not really embracing the reality, it's very difficult to change. You have to embrace the difficult reality. And then there's this choosing of an approach, evolution or revolution. Either small, step-by-step incremental change or burn the ships, all in today, here we go. And you have to sort that out, any change in your life. So today, I want us to look at the notion of God and our money in a way that's loftier than we did last week. Last week was very practical. I'm talking about debt and spending and saving and percentage rates, all those things. I think if we really want to fundamentally change something, it will be helpful to go to a next level, to a loftier desire. And I'm going to ask you a question in just a moment. And when I ask you this question, I'm then going to be quiet. We're all going to be quiet for about 30 seconds. And I just want you to feel the feelings. I want you to really just try to answer this question in your head. I want you to think about how it makes you feel, okay? So this isn't just about savings or debt or spending or whatever. It's bigger than that. And here's the question. What would God say to you about money? And let me personalize it. What do you think God would say to you about your money? Now, we're just going to be quiet for about 30 seconds here. And I really want you to think about that. I want you to think, what would God say to me about my money? All right, let's just be quiet. Oh, this is so fascinating to me on so many levels. I wish I could have a conversation with each one of you right now to say, what do you think God is saying to you about money? And I wouldn't be so interested in your particular answer as I would be about how do you perceive God's tone when he's talking to you? And maybe in particular when he's talking to you about your money. Do you perceive that God's tone would be judgy? That he's probably mad? You're probably doing it wrong, and he probably has a word of correction for you. That's probably what God would say to you about your money. Or do you not see it that way? Do you think, no. When I was thinking about this question, I thought, oh, God is like a sage. God has wisdom that I don't have, and he would bring to me wisdom about my financial life. Or is your perception that if God was speaking to you about your money, he would actually be overflowing with affirmation and gratitude and thankfulness of what you're doing and how you're handling your money? Would God be saying, good job, well done, thank you for making it? I'm wildly curious the tone with which you perceive God. And of course, I'm curious about that far beyond the question that integrates with money, but that is the conversation we're having today. A.W. Tozer, who's a theologian, said, "What comes to your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you." I was sitting yesterday at Panera with someone who, not a complete atheist, agnostic, really. We were having a conversation. And I shared that quote with the person who doesn't believe in, at least in the personal God represented by Jesus. And I said, A.W. Tozer says, what comes to mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. And I think that has to do with tone and posture as much as words. I'm wildly curious how you think about God. And I want to do my best over the next 15 minutes or so to speak to you words that I believe God would say and is saying to you about your money. And I want to do my very best to capture the right spirit and the right tone of that, so that beyond just practical step 1, 2, and 3, you would get a sense of what God is saying. Now, before I move on from this, let me ask you one question and give you a little context. Be honest about this, just in your head. If God actually said something to you about your money, and it was a direction that you're not taking now, it would require a change in your life, and you sensed God was really saying it to you, would you change it? Like on the spot, if God spoke to me with clarity, this isn't like some interpretive difficulty, with clarity, and he said to you, you're doing this with your money, I want you to do this with your money, would you change it? I think this is, again, a question of how we see and perceive God. Many people, myself included sometimes, treat God as a consultant. You know how we treat consultants. We would like their wisdom and their advice so that I can consider that as one of my options. I also have my wisdom and advice. I have my desires. Maybe God's telling me I should change something that I don't want to change. Which one do I go with? And I think it's one of the most fascinating postures that human beings take with God, is to say, you know what? Yeah, I'll listen. I'll consider it. I may or may not do it. Just some things worth thinking about. So in order to live in this kind of lofty world of what might God say to you about your money in the bigger picture, I'm going to use two passages and kind of got to weave them back and forth, but I want to give you the context for both. One is a story that Jesus told. It's recorded in Matthew chapter 25. Matthew is one of the biographers of Jesus. Matthew actually had a wild financial world himself. He was a tax collector who had his whole life changed by Jesus. And we like to center things in the story of Jesus here, so I think it's important to see what was Jesus teaching us when he told a story about money. And the other passage is from a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to a guy named Timothy. Now, Timothy was a pastor. And the Apostle Paul was writing to Timothy to tell Timothy what he should teach to his church about money. And you'll see how clearly these overlap. Of course, Paul was teaching out of what Jesus had taught and just naming things maybe in more practical or concrete ways. And so, with that in mind, what would God say to you about money? I think the first thing that he says is to lay a foundation, and the foundation is, I'm trusting you. I'm trusting you. This is one of my favorite things to say to my kids. Even in our workplace here, I have 3 people who report to me on our staff. It's one of my favorite things to say to any of the 3 people who report to me, to say, hey, I trust you. I'm trusting you. What happens when someone says they trust you? Well, there's clarity, right? They're saying, it's your call. It's your call. I'm not going to mess with it. Your call. When someone says they're trusting you, they're saying, it's your call and you're responsible. Right? So don't make the call without taking the responsibility. And interestingly, there's an element when someone says, I'm trusting you, where they're saying, it's your call, and I'm trusting you with my stuff. When I was a teenager, my dad, I don't know if he was going through a midlife crisis or what, but why would you do this when you have teenage sons? He bought a Chevy Camaro IROC Z28. It was midnight blue. It had T-tops. And I really liked it a lot. And, it wasn't for me. He didn't buy it for me. He bought it for him. But prom was coming. And don't you think your teenage son should get to take the IROC Z28 midnight blue without the T-tops to prom with his girlfriend? I thought so. And so I asked my dad, Dad, did I take that car to prom? And he said yes. And you know what he said? Like, I'm in my tux. He's tossing me the keys. He's like, hey, I trust you. What was he saying? He's saying he trusted me, that I get to make the calls. He's saying I am responsible for what's going on. And he was actually reminding me that it's not mine, it's his. I'm trusting you with my thing. And when it comes to our financial world, this is the foundational posture of God. I want you to hear this. Every dollar that you have in the bank, every possession that you own, what God is saying to you is, I trust you. You get to choose. You'll be responsible. And of course it's mine. Everything here on earth is mine. In Matthew chapter 25, when Jesus is telling this story, it's this parable, it says, it'll be like a man, being God, going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. This is the posture of God, and I want you to feel the feelings of being trusted by God with your money. And it says, to one, he gave 5 bags of gold, to another, 2 bags, and to another, 1 bag. And that's always such an interesting passage to me, that the scripture actually tells us within this story why people had different amounts. Now, sometimes people will come and say, Greg, is that right? Does God just give people different amounts of money? Doesn't the Bible say all men are created equal? I'm always like, that's not the Bible. That's the Declaration of Independence, actually. God gives different amounts to different people, actually based on his trust in them. So, what is God saying to you about your money? Foundationally, he's saying, I trust you. The second thing he would say is give you an awareness. He'd want you to know, hey, it's tempting. Money is tempting. Now, again, depending on how you read God's posture in this, it might seem like an aggressive warning where he's anticipating that you're going to mess up, but I don't think so. I remember the first time my son and daughter went to Wheeler Middle School over here in Crown Point, and they're in 6th grade, and it's the end of the 6th grade year, and they're like, hey, some of my friends are walking to the square and hanging out at McDonald's and all that instead of coming home. Dad, can I do that? And I'm like, I trust you. And then I would say, hey, let's talk about it a little bit. When you're by yourself, when you're with your friends, like, I'm not anticipating that you're going to screw up, but I do want to give you a little lay of the land. I want to give you some awareness of the potholes that are out there, the minefields that you could be walking into, and how you need to make sure that you carry yourself. And I think financially, this is the gift God gives to us. He knows how powerful money is, and he's trusting us with it. So he says, hey, just be aware, it's tempting. For example, he says, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Now, money's not the root of all kinds of evil, but it is tempting that if you start to love money, that's where it's going to go wrong. And we should just all pay attention to that. Can I confess something to you? Last year, our elders do a review with me every year, and they ask me about my leadership, and they ask me about my life, and all these things. And last year, I told them, they asked me if I had any temptations in my life. And I told them, actually, I feel like I'm having a reverse midlife crisis. I'm just going to say this out loud to you. And they're like, reverse midlife crisis? What do you mean? I'm like, you know how many people I've seen over my years in ministry who spent the first 20, 25 years of their life, they ran hard, they made lots of money, they accumulated wealth, they had it all, and then they get to a place in their life and they're like, but why? And they were lacking meaning in their life. And then they make a shift from this chase of wealth to a meaningful life, or they want to make a shift. I'm like, I'm having the opposite. For 20, 25 years, I've been running after the meaningful things of life. And these days, I kind of want money. And I say that to our elders as a confession of temptation. Because I don't want it to catch me. I don't want to fall in love with money. But I think any of us would be fooling ourselves if with the world we live in, we didn't say, you know what, that is kind of a temptation. To fall in love with money. And as soon as I said it out loud to our elders, you know what all of our elders did? They looked at me and they're like, yeah, me too. Me too. If we're not paying attention to that, that's a big, big challenge. It's interesting, it says in this verse, some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and they pierced themselves with many griefs. And what he's describing here, maybe you've experienced this in your life, is he said, when you start to love money, here's what you do. You trade more important things for money and you break your life. Do you know how many people, well, of course you're in the room, how many people have traded good health in order to get money? They stop sleeping right, they don't take time to exercise, they don't do any of that while they're chasing money. It's essentially a trade to say, I want money, my health can come later, and it's a dumb decision. Who in their right mind would trade their health so they can have money? Some people, because they love money, trade relationships for money. Their marriage is broken down, distance has been created with their children. They don't have any friends, all because they're chasing money. And God's just saying, well, you should just take a warning about that, because you don't want to get to a place in your life where you have money and no friends. You have money, but you don't have a family that loves you. Or like, that's just a dumb trade. Some people trade money for spiritual credibility. Some people keep all their money and they don't make any difference in the world with it. Like, just be careful about that love of money. I think God is saying it's tempting. And 1 Timothy says, command those who are in this present world not to be arrogant or to put their hope in wealth. You know what's tempting? Is to say, what are your hopes and dreams, and have them all be tied to money. And God's saying, oh, that's tempting, but that's silly, that's dumb. If your hopes and dreams are to be able to retire at a certain lifestyle, but your hopes and dreams aren't to make a difference in the world or to be the most amazing husband you can be or to do it, like, don't put your hopes and dreams in money. Don't do that. Tempting. There's another passage here. It says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and we will take nothing out of it. The voice of God is trying to help us see lofty things. He's trying to help you see that this life matters, but it doesn't matter as much as the next life. And this life, you came into it with nothing, and you're going to leave it with nothing. I got a buddy who's a pastor friend, only pastor would say this. Never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul. Like, when you die, you're going with nothing. And it's just like, so how about just aim at contentment here? Well, what steals contentment? Very simple answer to this. Comparison. What is it that makes you want more than you have? More money, more things that money can buy, more experiences and more vacations. One of the things that makes you want more is Instagram. Because you look at what someone else has. We used to say keeping up with the Joneses, or the grass looks greener on the other side of the house. By the way, the Joneses are broke. I mean, while they're living their lifestyle, they're broke. And this sense of being content with what I have, to say, you know what? My net worth is not an indication of my self-worth. They have nothing to do with each other. I could be content without money, just as content as I am. But it's tempting. That's what God's saying. He's like, pay attention, because it's tempting. And then I think God, if you could hear the voice of God, he would give you a function for your money. Like, what are you supposed to do with it? And what he's going to say is, put it to work. Put it to work. And here's the orientation for this. Money should never be the goal. Never. Money is not the end. Money is always a means to the end. You can't let money be the master. Money has to be the servant that you put to work to accomplish what you actually want in life. And this is so interesting. When Jesus was telling this story, he says, the man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work. He understood that having money wasn't the end, that you could actually do things with money that matter in this life. And that's where the power is. In this particular story, 2 of the 3 people took their money and put it to work, and they were affirmed by God. And one of them took his money and buried it in the ground as if the money was what was valuable. And that man was not affirmed. Back to this passage where Paul's telling Pastor Timothy how to do this. He says, hey, to your church, this might as well be Paul writing to Greg to say, hey, here's what you should tell Suncrest. Greg, command them to put their hope in God. And then this is the question, how would you use that money? If I'm supposed to put it to work, what am I supposed to put it to work doing? And there's 2 things in this passage. I want you to see them both. Put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. I want to be the voice of God in your life. To say that one of the things you ought to put your money to work doing, according to God, is you ought to go enjoy some things. Like he has given it to you, and he loves you. He doesn't hate you. And so since he's given it to you, and he loves you, he might toss you the keys to the Camaro. Let's go enjoy it. My dad was happy that I was happy. And your Heavenly Father is happy that you're happy. It is not sinful at all to say, God's given this to me to provide for enjoyment. And, he says, Greg, command them to be generous and willing to share. So use it for your enjoyment. Use it for your family's enjoyment. Use it to create great experiences for people that you love. Use it that way. And make sure you don't use it all on yourself. Like, I've given you money. It's a broken world that we live in. There are needs all around you. Make sure you're taking a serious chunk of your money, and say, I enjoy myself, and I'm generous and willing to share. How would you put your money to work? If I could be the voice of God in your life, I'd say, hey, make sure you're enjoying yourself, and make sure you're generous and willing to share. Don't do one without the other. Don't enjoy yourself and not be generous and willing to share. Don't be generous and willing to share and not enjoy yourself. The voice of God. How you put your money to work. Do both of these. And then this is interesting. He says at the end, in this way, if you do this, you do both of these, you'll lay up treasure for yourselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, for the afterlife. And it's so fascinating to me that God is essentially saying your money is a means to an end. It's a means to an end in this life. It can bring you about enjoyment. It can bring you about making a difference in the world when somebody's in need. And actually, after this life, the way you handle your money in this life, you put it to work here, and you will experience the blessings and benefits of that in the life to come. Man, if that's true, wouldn't you want to know that? This is the voice of God in your life. Because ultimately, if you're to hear the voice of God, I want us to hear, well done. Well done. It's interesting, this phrase, well done, my good and faithful servant, a lot of times is used by people like me and maybe people like you at a funeral after someone's lived a long life and they've lived a godly life and they've kind of done the right things, and you say, well, at the end of their life, well done, good and faithful servant. But the context for that phrase is not a funeral. The context for that phrase is in Matthew chapter 25, after someone went and put their money to work. And the voice of God, oh man, I want you to receive this. I want you to receive it either for how you are today or as a vision for where you could be one day. That you and I, and how we handle our money, God would just say to us, well done. Good job. I trusted you with it. Gave you a couple warnings about where you could get off track. You paid attention to those warnings. I said, make sure you're putting it to work. Do that for your enjoyment. Do it to be generous and willing to share. Help people in need. You doing that with your money? You're killing it. Well done. You're a good and a faithful servant. And I hope you receive that today. To want to hear the voice of God. To gain wisdom and perspective that we have trouble getting on our own, but the scriptures give to us every day. And if necessary, to reorient our financial lives around the voice of God. That if he speaks clearly, we would not treat him as a consultant. Actually, if I could say it this clearly, there are people in this room who are not followers of Jesus. It's perfectly acceptable. It would only make sense for you to treat the wisdom of God as a consultant. And there are people in this room who are followers of Jesus. You've said that Christ, my Savior, Christ is the leader, Christ is the Lord of my life. Whatever he leads me to, I will do. And my prayer for you is that if you sense the voice of God, you will do whatever he asks you to do.
Summer has just started. Your kids may have just wrapped up school or maybe wrapping it up shortly, but I want to encourage you this summer, there is some amazing stuff happening at Suncrest Kids and Suncrest students that your child, whether they're birth through 5th grade, where they'd be engaged as Suncrest Kids, or they're 6th grade through 12th grade, that's Suncrest students. I don't want your child to miss out on some amazing opportunities to, one, have some fun with other kids their age, but two, maybe give them space to prioritize their faith journey in a new way this summer. You can find all those details at either suncrest.org/kids or suncrest.org/students. Or better yet, just head to suncrest.org and you'll find all sorts of details about how you and your whole family can maybe make strides in their faith journey this summer.
I'll follow where your spirit leads. Broken as my life may be, I will give you every piece. I hear you call. I am available. I say, yes, Lord. I am available. Here I am with open hands, counting on your grace again. Less of me and more of you. I just wanna see you move. give me life. Nothing is a sacrifice. Oh, use me how you want to, God. Have your throne within my heart. I hear you call. I am available. I say yes, Lord. I am available.
Every week, we pause everything we do to focus on the love of Jesus through a time called communion. We do that in person by taking bread and juice, but on demand and online, go ahead and grab whatever food and drink you have available to you to represent Jesus' body, which was broken for us on the cross, and his blood, which was poured out for us on the cross, so that we might know what real love and real life look like in really life-changing ways. So if you're someone who follows Jesus and you want to participate in that, find something to eat and drink now. If you're someone who's watching this and you're like, I don't know that I believe that, I don't know that I define myself as a Jesus follower, well, instead of grabbing something to eat and drink, go ahead and take these next few moments to pause. Give yourself the space to reflect on what you've heard so far and maybe be open to the idea that God has been trying to get your attention this whole time. With that, I'm going to put a timer and some scripture on the screen to give all of us a moment to either take bread and juice and reflect on Jesus' love, or to pause and reflect on what we've heard so far. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit the like button. If you know someone or your social media feeds could use hearing some of this practical advice, hit the share button on YouTube or Facebook. And ultimately, if you want to see more content from Suncrest Church, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel. I hope you've enjoyed episode 2 of Keep the Change, and I hope that you join us next week as we wrap this series up and we look at how we can have financial freedom that allows you and I to maybe say more often, hey, you can keep the change. We'll see you guys next time.